I never thought a stack of firewood would turn into the biggest fight I ever had with a neighbor, but that is exactly what happened. I was accused of stealing from a man who lived 3 houses down from me, and within a week, my name was attached to a police report for something I never did. The strange part was, the person who claimed I stole from him was actually the one who had been taking from me the entire time. I live in a quiet little town outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado, the kind of place where people wave when they drive by and everyone knows who owns which truck parked in front of which house. I moved there because I wanted peace, not drama. After 20 years of working long hours, raising my kids, and dealing with enough stress to last a lifetime, all I wanted was a small home, a little land, and a normal routine. Every fall, I prepared my firewood the same way. I bought it from a local supplier named Miller Creek Timber, stacked it carefully along the east side of my property, covered it with a heavy tarp, and organized it almost like someone organizing books on a shelf. My wife used to joke that my woodpile was the only thing in the yard that looked more organized than my garage. She was probably right. I liked knowing that when winter came, everything was ready. One cold morning in November, I walked outside with my coffee in hand and noticed something looked wrong. A section of my woodpile was smaller than it should have been. At first, I honestly didn't think much of it. Maybe a few pieces rolled away. Maybe someone nearby needed a couple of logs and figured they would replace them later. It wasn't worth starting a neighborhood war over a few pieces of firewood. I had no idea that was just the beginning. 2 days later, I was cleaning leaves off my driveway when I saw my neighbor, Daniel Whitaker, walking toward me with his phone in his hand. Daniel was the kind of guy who always seemed like he was looking for a reason to be offended. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than I had, and he carried himself like that gave him some kind of authority over everyone else. He stopped at the end of my driveway, pointed his phone toward me, and said, "We need to talk." The way he said it immediately told me this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "About what?" I asked. He stepped closer and pointed toward my woodpile. "You know exactly what." I looked behind me, confused. "No, Daniel, I really don't." His face turned red. "You've been taking my firewood at night." For a second, I actually thought he was joking. I waited for the smile, the laugh, anything that would show he was messing around. It never came. "Excuse me," I said. He lifted his phone like he was presenting evidence in a courtroom. "My woodpile has been shrinking for weeks. I have pictures. I know it's you. I just stood there because sometimes your brain needs a few seconds to process something that makes absolutely no sense." This wasn't an argument about a fence line or a barking dog. This man was accusing me of sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night and stealing his firewood. Then he said the part that made me realize how serious he was. "You owe me $900, or I'm calling the police." I almost laughed because the whole thing sounded ridiculous. $900? For firewood? But then I looked at his face and realized he wasn't angry because of the money. He had already decided I was guilty. I told him calmly, "Daniel, I have receipts for every piece of wood I bought. Every delivery came from the same supplier. I can show you everything." I went inside, grabbed the folder where I kept my home records, and showed him the receipts. Dates, payments, delivery confirmations, all of it. Instead of looking surprised, he just shook his head. "Receipts don't prove anything." That sentence stuck with me because it told me something important. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for confirmation. "I have pictures," he said. My pile keeps getting smaller. I looked him directly in the eye and said, "Then call the police if you really believe that. I have nothing to hide." I thought that would be the end of it. I thought maybe once someone official looked at the situation, common sense would return. I was wrong. A week later, I received a call from an officer with the Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department. Daniel had filed a theft report against me. He had submitted photos showing his woodpile getting smaller, and he told them I was the only person who could have done it. I remember sitting there in my kitchen after that call, just staring out the window. It wasn't the accusation itself that bothered me the most. It was the fact that someone who lived so close to me had chosen to turn me into a criminal in his mind without ever asking a simple question. I could have walked over and talked to him. I could have helped him figure out what happened. But instead, he went straight for the accusation. I knew I needed to handle this carefully. Getting angry was exactly what someone like Daniel expected, so I called an attorney I had worked with before, a man named Robert Ellis. I explained everything from the missing wood to the police report. He listened quietly and then asked one question. "Do you have security cameras?" I told him I did. He paused for a moment and said, "Good, then we don't need guesses. We need the whole story." At the time, I didn't know it, but those words were about to completely change everything. The next morning, Robert came by my house with a small notebook and a cup of coffee, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my quiet little woodpile had somehow turned into a legal problem. He walked around my property, looked at the camera locations, and asked me to show him exactly where the missing wood had been. I expected him to tell me this was probably just a misunderstanding, that maybe Daniel had made a mistake and everything would blow over, but Robert wasn't the type of person who guessed. He looked at every detail like it mattered. "The biggest mistake people make in situations like this," he told me, "is they focus on proving they're innocent before they understand the entire picture. Let's find out what really happened." That sentence stayed with me, because honestly, deep down, I still wanted to believe Daniel was just embarrassed and would eventually admit he was wrong. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to ruin someone's life. I just wanted my name cleared and my neighbor to understand that accusing someone without evidence has consequences. We sat down in my office and started reviewing the security footage from the cameras around my property. At first, everything looked normal. There were hours of nothing but wind moving through the trees, squirrels running across the fence, and the occasional delivery truck passing by. It was almost boring, and I started wondering if maybe we were wasting our time. Then Robert stopped the video. "Go back." I leaned forward. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He rewound the footage and slowed it down. There, just after midnight, was a truck parked near the edge of Daniel's property. A figure stepped out, walked toward the side of his house, and disappeared from view. At first, I couldn't see clearly enough to identify the person. Then the person turned slightly toward the camera. It was Daniel. I felt my stomach drop. Not because I was shocked that he was involved, but because I was realizing how much effort he had put into building a false story. Robert kept watching. Daniel wasn't walking toward my property. He was walking toward his own woodpile. He loaded several pieces of firewood into the back of his truck, drove away, and then returned later that same night. But what happened next was the part that made everything worse. After removing the wood, Daniel rearranged the remaining logs. He pulled sections apart, moved stacks closer to the fence line, and created the appearance that his pile had been slowly disappearing. He wasn't just losing firewood. He was creating a story where he was the victim and I was the thief. I sat there quietly watching the screen because sometimes the truth doesn't make you feel better right away. Sometimes it just makes you realize how close you came to being hurt by someone else's choices. "He's staging it," I said. Robert nodded. "Yes. And that's not all." We kept going through the footage from the following weekends. Then we saw something neither of us expected. Daniel wasn't working alone. Every Saturday morning, his younger brother, Kevin, would stop by. Kevin would walk over, grab a few pieces of wood, throw them into his vehicle, and leave. The funniest part, if there was anything funny about the situation, was that Kevin had no idea what he was doing. Every single time he walked away, he looked directly at the camera and casually waved. It was almost like he was saying hello to the evidence that would eventually prove everything. Robert actually smiled when he saw that. Well, I guess he wanted to make sure the camera knew who he was. I laughed for the first time in days because the situation had become so unbelievable. But then we found the detail that completely destroyed Daniel's accusation: the timestamps. Every night Daniel claimed I was sneaking over to steal his firewood. I wasn't even home. I had been traveling for work several hours away. Hotel records, business appointments, and my own phone location data all matched the camera timeline. Daniel hadn't just accused the wrong person. He had accused someone who physically could not have done what he claimed. That was the moment I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something different. I felt disappointed, because neighbors don't have to be best friends. They don't have to invite each other over for dinner or know every detail about each other's lives. But there is supposed to be a basic level of trust, a basic understanding that you don't destroy someone's reputation because you are too stubborn to admit you might be wrong. Robert gathered everything together and prepared our response. He contacted the sheriff's department and explained that we had additional evidence. The officer who originally called me reviewed the footage and immediately changed his tone. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this is a completely different situation than what was reported." I knew exactly what he meant. Daniel had walked into the station with a story where he was the victim. Now the evidence showed something completely different. A few days later, Robert and I sat across from Daniel and his attorney during a formal meeting before the court hearing. Daniel looked different. The confidence he had when he stood in my driveway was gone. He avoided eye contact and kept shuffling papers around like he was searching for an explanation hidden somewhere in the folder. Robert placed the evidence on the table and calmly said, "You reported my client for theft. You provided selected images, but you failed to provide the full recordings that show what actually happened." Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I didn't think those parts were important." Robert leaned back. "You didn't think the parts showing you taking your own firewood were important?" The room went completely silent. Daniel had no answer. And honestly, neither did I, because I was still trying to understand how someone could build such an elaborate accusation and convince himself he was the victim. The hearing date was scheduled for the following week. I remember driving to the courthouse that morning feeling strangely calm. A month earlier, I was just a homeowner stacking firewood for winter. Now I was walking into a courtroom to defend myself against the story someone else created. But I also knew one thing: the truth doesn't need a performance. It just needs to be shown. And we were about to show all of it. The courtroom was much quieter than I expected. After everything that had happened over the past few weeks, after the accusations, the angry conversations, the uncomfortable looks from people in the neighborhood, and the feeling that my own home had somehow become a place where I needed to defend myself, I thought walking into that room would feel like some kind of battle, but it didn't. It felt almost ordinary. People were sitting quietly. Papers were being organized. The clock on the wall kept moving, and everyone was waiting for the same thing: the truth to finally be separated from the story Daniel had created. I remember looking across the room at him and thinking about how different he looked compared to the day he came storming up my driveway. Back then, he had been confident. He had his phone in his hand. His voice was loud, and he carried himself like someone who had already won. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't trying to understand. He had already decided who the villain was, and unfortunately for me, he had decided that person was me. But sitting in that courtroom, he wasn't that same person anymore. His shoulders were lower. His eyes avoided mine, and he kept moving papers around in front of him like there was some missing explanation hidden somewhere in that stack. There wasn't. The evidence was already there. It had been there the entire time. It just wasn't the evidence he wanted people to see. My attorney, Robert Ellis, stood up and presented everything calmly. That was one thing I appreciated about Robert from the beginning. He never acted angry. He never tried to turn the situation into a personal revenge story. He understood something I was slowly learning myself. When someone tries to drag you into chaos, the best response is usually not more chaos. It's patience, it's facts, it's letting the truth do the talking. He started with the photos Daniel submitted, the pictures that were supposed to prove his firewood had been stolen. He showed the court how those images only captured certain moments and left out the important parts. Then he moved to the security footage. The room became completely silent as the video played. There was Daniel walking outside late at night. There was Daniel loading firewood into his own truck. There was Daniel moving the remaining logs around afterward, creating the exact appearance that someone had been taking them. And then there was his brother Kevin, showing up week after week, casually taking pieces of wood and waving at the camera without realizing he was leaving behind the one thing Daniel never expected: proof. Watching it all again was strange. You would think seeing someone exposed after accusing you would make you feel satisfied, maybe even angry in a way that feels justified. But honestly, I felt something different. I felt tired. Because by that point, I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about how unnecessary all of it had been. A simple conversation could have prevented everything. A simple question like, "Hey, have you noticed anything strange happening around the wood piles?" could have saved everyone time, money, and frustration. Instead, Daniel chose the most damaging option first. He chose accusation before understanding. Then Robert presented the timeline. This was the part that completely destroyed Daniel's story. Every night, he claimed I had walked onto his property and stolen from him. I was nowhere near my house. I was traveling for work. The dates matched my hotel records. My business schedule matched the camera footage. My phone records confirmed my location. The accusation wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. I remember watching Daniel's attorney lean over and whisper something to him. For the first time since this started, Daniel looked less like someone defending himself and more like someone searching for a way out. Then the judge looked up from the documents and asked the question everyone in that room was thinking. "Mr. Whitaker, why did you not provide the complete recordings from your own property when you filed this complaint?" Daniel shifted in his chair. His face changed. It was a small moment, but I noticed it. The confidence disappeared. "I didn't think those sections were relevant," he said quietly. The judge looked at him for a long second. "The sections showing you removing the firewood yourself were not relevant?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was one of those moments where silence becomes louder than an argument. Daniel had spent weeks trying to convince everyone that I was dishonest, but the one person who needed to believe him most, the court, was now looking at the evidence he tried to hide. The judge dismissed the accusation immediately. He also made it clear that filing false reports was not something to be taken lightly. Daniel was ordered to cover the legal expenses I had accumulated while defending myself. It wasn't a massive punishment. It wasn't some dramatic movie ending where someone gets publicly destroyed. But maybe that's what made it feel more real. The point was never to ruin Daniel. The point was to make sure he understood that words have consequences. Accusing someone of a crime is not a harmless mistake. It can affect their reputation, their relationships, and the way people see them. Walking out of the courthouse that afternoon, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt relieved. There's a big difference between those two things. Victory is about defeating someone. Relief is about finally putting something heavy down. For weeks, I had carried the frustration of knowing someone was telling a version of reality where I was the bad guy. I had watched people in the neighborhood become uncomfortable around me. I had wondered what conversations were happening when I wasn't there. And now, finally, I didn't have to explain myself anymore. The facts had already done that for me. When I returned home, I stood beside my woodpile for a few minutes. It sounds strange, but that stack of firewood represented more than just fuel for winter. It represented patience. It represented restraint. It represented the fact that sometimes you can do everything right and still find yourself forced to defend something you shouldn't have had to defend in the first place. A few days later, I saw Daniel outside. I was expecting something. Maybe an apology, maybe an awkward conversation, maybe even an attempt to explain himself. But none of that happened. He looked over, saw me, and immediately looked away. Part of me wanted to be angry about that. I wanted him to admit what he did. I wanted him to say, I was wrong. But over time, I realized something big. Sometimes people avoid apologies because saying sorry would force them to face the person they hurt. And some people would rather stay silent than admit they were wrong. The neighborhood changed after that. People who had heard Daniel's side of the story eventually heard the truth. A few neighbors stopped by and apologized for assuming the worst. One older gentleman from across the street told me, "I should have asked you before I believed anything. That's on me." And honestly, that meant more to me than I expected. Because mistakes happen. People misunderstand things. But the difference between a mistake and a choice is what happens after you learn the truth. Some people correct themselves. Some people double down. Daniel chose silence. I chose to move on. A week later, a new load of firewood arrived at my house. I stacked it the same way I always had, one row at a time, neat and organized, covered for the winter. But this time, I adjusted one of my cameras so it had a clearer view of the area near the fence. Not because I wanted another confrontation. Not because I wanted to catch someone. I simply learned a lesson. Being a good neighbor doesn't mean leaving yourself completely unprotected. Being calm doesn't mean allowing someone to walk over you. And being kind doesn't mean ignoring the moment when someone crosses a line. I still believe most people are good. I still believe neighbors should help each other. I still believe a conversation should come before an accusation. But I also believe trust is something people build through actions, not something they demand while ignoring their own behavior. Looking back now, the firewood was never the real issue. The real issue was what happens when someone decides they need a villain more than they need the truth. Daniel needed someone to blame, and for a while, he chose me. But facts have a way of catching up. Cameras don't care about opinions. Records don't care about pride. And the truth doesn't need someone to defend it with anger. It just needs someone willing to show it. So now, I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have tried one more time to sit down with Daniel and talk things out before involving the law? Or do you think someone who makes a serious accusation like that crosses a line immediately? Do you think people who knowingly file false reports should face stronger consequences? Or was paying legal fees and receiving a warning enough? Share your thoughts in the comments because situations like this always reveal something interesting about how we view trust, fairness, and justice. And if you believe the truth should always matter more than the loudest voice in the room, make sure to share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Because sometimes the person who stays calm isn't the person who has nothing to say. Sometimes they're the person who already knows the truth will eventually speak for itself.